Daniel Penny was acquitted Monday of criminally negligent homicide in the death of 30-year-old Jordan Neely in New York City on Monday. Chants of no justice, no peace, you may not be surprised to learn, could be heard after the not guilty verdict outside the courtroom in New York City. Now, that came after a judge dismissed the manslaughter charge when the jury was deadlocked on Friday. But here to tell us much more in detail about what happened just over the course of the last several days in this case is Nicole Gelinas, who is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and author of the well-timed book called Movement, New York's Long War to Take Back Its Streets from the Car. Nicole, thank you for being here.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me on this afternoon.
So can you tell us about what happened between Friday and Monday when the not guilty verdict came in? So that's a verdict in the case of criminally negligent homicide. The manslaughter charge was dismissed on Friday. What happened here?
Well, I think the short answer is that nobody is sure what happened. So we'll go back to Friday. The jury had begun deliberations on Tuesday afternoon on two counts. The manslaughter count, second-degree manslaughter, which carried 15-year sentence, and the criminal negligence homicide count, which carried a 4-year sentence. Now, in many cases, you can be convicted of more than one felony. But in this case, the jury knew, and presumably the prosecutors also knew, you can only be convicted in one or the other. In other words, it's either manslaughter or criminally negligent homicide. It's not both. So the instructions to the jury on Tuesday, which all the sides knew and signed off on, were the jury is to deliberate manslaughter. They do that first. They don't think about criminally negligent homicide. And when they reach a verdict on manslaughter, then they think about criminally negligent homicide. So they came back and they said, we're deadlocked. We can't come up with a verdict on manslaughter. Judge sent them back to deliberate more. This is Friday morning. Come back again after a couple hours. They say, we're deadlocked. We're not going to reach a verdict. Now, under every other case in New York State, if you deadlock on this top charge, there's a mistrial, because if they can't finish deliberating on the top charge, they will never get to the second charge. So the prosecution badly wanted to avoid a mistrial. They said they would do something novel, which is dismiss the charge. So after 6 weeks of testimony, after all these witnesses, after making all these signs that they really believed in this manslaughter charge, that they thought it was important to take a manslaughter charge, they gave up their right effectively to ever try it again. They did not want the mistrial, and they did not want the ability to try it again. They wanted to dismiss it. The judge agreed over the defense objections, because the defense was concerned if you dismiss the top charge, it sends a signal to the jury, well, we're letting this other charge stand, so you should convict on that. He said it was coercive and manipulative. The judge dismissed those, overruled those objections, sent it back to the jury for them to start deliberating on criminal negligence this morning. So they did that. It did not take them very long to get to their verdict of not guilty this morning. When you think about how they were called in and out of the courtroom for an additional instruction, only took them about an hour this morning to get to their verdict right before 11:30.
Were you surprised by how all of this transpired over the last several days?
I am surprised at the machinations of the prosecution and the judge in dismissing the top count. I am not surprised at the not guilty verdict. I think once we learned that they were a hung jury, or would have been a hung jury on the top charge, both of these charges require that the prosecutor prove two things. One, that Daniel Penny killed Jordan Neely, so you need the cause of death to be asphyxiation. And two, that he was not justified in killing Jordan Neely. That is, he wasn't justified in using deadly force because there was no imminent threat of deadly force used against him, and he wasn't justified in using regular force because Neely wasn't a threat. So the prosecution had to prove those things on both these charges. The fact that there was a hung jury indicated that the prosecution hadn't proven them. So if they hadn't proven them on one charge, they wouldn't prove it on the other. They're not going to change their minds over the weekend. So I think people thought it would be a mistrial. I think it's not surprising that they didn't come back with a guilty verdict. It may be a little surprising to some people that they came back with a firm acquittal. But honestly, I took notebooks and notebooks full of notes during this trial. I mean, we've been there 8 weeks. I only missed 3 hours court. I was reviewing and typing up all my notes over the weekend, and it made me think the prosecution case was not as strong as it sometimes came off in open court. So if the jury was thinking the same thing I was, obviously they were.
Was that because of the representation, the legal representation? Do you think that they could have made a stronger case and they just didn't live up to that?
No, I think the prosecution made the strongest case that it could. This was a weak case from the beginning. The prosecution had to basically admit from the start that Neely, because he was in a mental health crisis, he was psychotic, he was high on K2, which exacerbates the psychosis, that a lot of people on the train found him threatening. I mean, the prosecution's own witnesses, we had a half a dozen or more witnesses called by the prosecution who said they were scared. Neely was coming toward them. One lady put her baby carriage in front of her baby to protect him. So the prosecution had a very difficult case. They made mistakes. I mean, the defense made mistakes too. In a long trial, everyone's going to make mistakes, but this was a hard case for the prosecution. I think people thought because it's a Manhattan jury and they don't like Trump, and the prosecutor sort of tried to tie in Penny with Trump in many subtle ways, including with his character witnesses, that the Manhattan jury would vote to convict. But they're not, they may live in Manhattan, but they're not that easily manipulable. They clearly considered all the facts carefully here.
Yeah, and some on the left, I'm curious what you make of this, because you probably saw some of this outside the courtroom, are saying things like "no justice, no peace," and I think it was Neely's family and some people close to Neely who have already said the system is rigged, and this is evidence of that. Is there any evidence of that, Nicole?
Understand why Neely's father and his uncle and his aunts are upset. I mean, they've gone through a long trial. I think the prosecution kind of led them along here. The city government failed Neely in many ways. I mean, we learned during the trial, we saw Neely's medical records. A city-run hospital said they wanted to keep Neely in restraints when he talked to the doctors because he posed a danger. But they let him out of the hospital over and over and over again. They knew he had schizophrenia. They offered him shelter suggestions. He never went to stay at the shelters. He was arrested many times. They never used these arrests as leverage to keep him confined to a hospital. He walked away from a treatment program. They never went and found him and got him and brought him back, even though he was in plain sight on the subways. The cops knew who he was. So the city government and state government failed Neely in a lot of ways. And this is just another of those ways. The Black Lives Matter protesters who are not related to the family, they're just kind of doing their fulminating thing. There's not a lot of them. There would never been more than a couple dozen. It's not like there's a broad city movement that is outraged by the verdict.
Yeah, and Nicole, before I let you go, you actually mentioned as we were beginning the tape that in your book, which again is called Movement, New York's Long War to Take Back Its Streets from the Car, you have a chapter on subway crime, and sort of makes sense with the thesis of your book. But if you could quickly just explain to us how you see this trial through that lens, I think that'd be really interesting.
Well, in 1990, New York had 26 homicides on the subway, and the city finally decided that is unacceptable. They tapped a new subway police chief, Bill Bratton, who put in practice a theory that other people had devised broken windows policing, you go after the small crimes and you prevent some of the big crimes. So people jumping over the turnstile, people aggressively panhandling, people smoking on the subway, you caught them doing that. And it's not that you're going to send them to prison, but a lot of times they had a weapon, they had a warrant out for their arrest. So you prevented them from using that weapon on the subway. You got them off the subway and got them in jail so that they could then agree to a mental health program to get out of jail. This worked for many years. We got the number of annual homicides on the subway down from 26 to 1 or 2 a year from 1997 to 2019. Everyone felt perfectly safe. Here we come into 2020, we have all these changes to our criminal justice laws to make them more lenient. So we kind of stopped doing that broken windows policing. Then we have COVID. So we had 7 murders on the subway in 2020, another 7 in 2021. We had 11 in 2022, and we had 6 in 2023, including the Neely homicide. So if the police had kept Neely from acting disruptively in the many, many times that he was disruptive on the subway, he would not have found himself in this situation. This situation, just statistically speaking, would not have arisen in the decade or decades, couple of decades before 2019. Of course, you can say you can't prove that any one incident would not have taken place. But statistically speaking, we've had a lot of these incidents. We had 2 other homicides that were dismissed because of justified homicide. They just didn't get any attention because the racial dynamics were different. But we had 2 of those cases, as well as the Penny case last year. So the more danger you have on the subway, the more people who are going to act in self-defense. And sometimes the perpetrator is the person who was killed. You stop these crimes before they happen, and you keep everybody safe.
Nicole, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Likewise.
All right. Well, please make sure there's a lot of breaking news today to subscribe here on the Undercurrents channel, wherever you download your podcasts, and of course over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience of the show. We will be back here soon with more.